Hi, yes, hello everyone, I'm Gavin.js, and today we are going to take a look at the new Blender 4.2 beta that has been released. It's been out for a little while, but I've been taking some time to kind of read over the notes, test out a few things, try and figure out as much as I can so that I can tell you all what's going on here in Geometry Nodes, right? I haven't figured out everything just yet, but a lot of these things are fairly straightforward, and there's enough in here that I need to just share this with you because there's a lot going on. There's a lot in this update as a whole, but just looking at geometry nodes, they have made a lot of significant changes, like just updates, optimizations, and new nodes, new features. There's a lot going on here. So let's just jump in here and take a look at some of the new nodes and node updates. And starting off, we have the Realize Instances node, which now supports partial realizing. Partial realizations? Anyway, if we take a look at Blender, I've got Blender 4.1 pulled up on the left and Blender 4.2 on the right. Let's just bring up our Realize Instances node. And we can see that there are a few new bells and whistles on the new Realize Instances node. The old one, we just had a geometry input output. It would take whatever geometry and realize any instances that are in that geometry, right? Now, we have the option to select some of our instances, right? So it's not going to just by default realize all of our instances, which is kind of nice because if we wanted that, we'd have to, again, separate everything and like identify which ones we want and just run those instances into this node. Now we can make a selection, and we have this little toggle that realizes all. So what does that mean? You can read here, realize all levels of nested instances for a top level instances. So what this toggle does is allows us to say, yes, we're going to realize all of our instances, right? If you have nested instances, then every layer of instances are all going to be realized. Before, it would just realize top level instances. So if we had a cube that had other cubes instanced on all of the points of that cube, and then we instanced that onto the points of another cube, and then we ran that through the realize instances node, we'd get 8 instances each with 8 cubes. But now we're able to realize all, and so if we run with that same example, we would get something like 64 cubes, 128 cubes, some power of 2 of cubes, which is a lot of cubes. Or we're able to use this depth input and tell it, okay, what level in our nested instances do we want to be able to realize up to? You're able to say how deep do you want to go before you want to keep your instances. At 0, we're not going to realize any instances whatsoever. At 1, we're going to realize that top level of instances, but everything else isn't going to be realized, and so on and so forth as you go through your layered instances, your nested instances. Next, we have updates to the sample nearest surface node and the geometry proximity node. And once again, we can see we've got a lot more options on our new node versus the old node. So here we have just a geometry input node. We have whatever mesh we want to sample across. We have the value that we're looking for, so whatever attribute it is that we want to know about at a given position. And then it returns that value, whatever attribute, from the mesh, from the geometry that is closest to that position. Here, though, in the updated version, we're able to do really the same thing, right? But now we have the group ID and sample group ID. This allows us to feed in any value that creates different groups of faces so that we're no longer sampling across the entire mesh and getting back the closest value anywhere on the mesh. We're able to take this group ID and a specific group ID and just sample across that group. So you don't have to sample across the entire mesh. You could just identify like a small portion of it. This should help a lot with processing time for large meshes, because if you're just looking at one small subset of your mesh instead of the entire thing, when you get, you know, thousands, millions of polygons, then yeah, it should run much more smoothly. In addition to having this value output, we also have an is valid output, which lets us know basically like, are we able to get an output from this group ID and this position? So if the group ID doesn't exist that we're trying to sample for, this will return false. And I'm sure there are a couple of other instances where this would return false, but just basically, if the sampling was successful, like it says here, it'll return true, and if not, it'll return false. Same thing applies to the geometry proximity node. We have these additional inputs and the additional is valid output. Same exact thing, and these are the only two sampling nodes that got updated with the group ID. Next, we have a few updates to the remove named attribute, the capture attribute, and the store named attribute. But first, let's look at the remove named attribute and capture attribute nodes, because these kind of go hand in hand. What we've got is that we're able to remove and capture multiple attributes with one node. So these look almost identical, except in Blender 4.2, we have this option for exact or wildcard. So how does this work? The example that the release notes give is if you have a prefix, and this works for both prefixes and suffixes. If you have the prefix sim asterisk, what this node will do now is look for any attribute that has the prefix sim. It'll then remove all attributes that begin with sim, instead of needing to have, a whole chain of different remove named attribute nodes. You can just use this wildcard and it'll remove all attributes with the same prefix or suffix. So it'll work in the same way here, except it'll remove all of the attributes that end in sim instead of beginning with sim. Now, if we take a look at the capture attribute node, you can see that we've actually lost some inputs in the 4.2 version, and that's simply because with the ability to capture multiple attributes on one node, we no longer need to define what data type this is. So in Blender 4.1 and earlier, we needed to explicitly tell it what data type it is that we want to capture, because we only have this one input socket. And it's great that we're able to change the socket type, but it makes it so that we can't input more. Whereas in the new version, we have an empty socket. That's at least what I've been calling it. I believe in the notes it said an extended socket. I guess that's the technical term. But anyway, this is like the input and output sockets for our geometry nodes. And we're able to just run any data type into here. And because of that, we no longer have to explicitly tell it what type it is. So we've got an integer, a float, a vector. We're able to just add as many inputs as we want to this node, and it'll store all of those onto whatever geometry we give it, which is really nice. Moving on to the stored named attribute node, we have a new data type that we're able to write to. It's not the same as the updates to the remove named attribute or capture attribute. Instead, we're just getting an additional data type, which has sort of always been supported. I don't know, this one's a little bit more technical than I usually get into. Basically, what they're saying here is that we have access to other data types that there just aren't sockets for, like 2D vector, or they say here float2 and byte colors. So we essentially have access to different data types that don't have socket types, because it's a little bit redundant. It's the same thing, it's just depending on the data you're storing. On the more technical level, you need additional data types, but Blender's abstracted some of that away. So now we have explicit access to the 8-bit int type, but is not a new socket type. So as one would expect, these two both look exactly the same. The only difference comes in that in Blender 4.1, we have the data types that we're pretty accustomed to, but in Blender 4.2, we have an additional data type. In fact, let me move this up so that you can see that more easily. We have all of the data types that we're accustomed to, but we also have the 8-bit integer. And then obviously we've got an additional data type here, but hey, we'll talk about that in a minute. Next, we have a bunch of updates to the rotation socket workflow kind of as a whole. And so they've outlined here what nodes get affected by this. And basically, they're just like reworking individual nodes to be better optimized and more intuitive to work with the rotation data type. Rotation or quaternion, whatever term you want to use there. So if we take a look at the first node on that list, we have the curve to points node, and in Blender 4.1, we have a rotation as a vector, but in Blender 4.2, we have a rotation instead. So just updating things to work with the new rotation type, right? Then we have the axis angle to rotation node, which has become the axes to rotation node. Basically, their idea here was to make this node more intuitive, and I agree with this because it's easier to visualize defining a rotation based on two axes as opposed to an axis and an angle. Because yeah, in Blender 4.1, we defined an axis and an angle, and that would tell you, like, if you've got a vector like this, right, it would tell you how much you would rotate, like in 3D space. That's what this output rotation is, right? How much it's going to rotate specifically on this axis and how you would transform everything like that. Right. The new version in Blender 4.2 instead defines two axes, which are typically your normal and your tangent, and then defines your normal, your tangent, and then defines your third axis based on those two. Just it defines a third axis that's perpendicular to the first two, and that creates the entire rotation. They're just trying to make it easier to work with rotation and easier to visualize. That's at least the way I interpret this. Hopefully that's easier for people to work with. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. Would you rather work with an angle or a couple of axes to determine rotations? Next, we have the align Euler to vector, which is now the align rotation to vector. These work pretty similarly. Like, I haven't really noticed a big difference, but I haven't tested this extensively. But yeah, basically they've just taken, again, this rotation vector and made it a rotation. And I think that's a really good change, honestly, because all the time I plug in my vector to the wrong the wrong input of these two, and it takes me a while to then debug why my rotation isn't getting output correctly. That's at least in Blender 4.1, whereas here it'll be more visually apparent what's going on. And then something to note is that they haven't fully gotten rid of the align Euler to vector. They've just deprecated it and given you a nice little pop-up here letting you know that it's deprecated. Anyway, in short, this node is now deprecated and been replaced by the align rotation to vector, but if you still want to use it for whatever reason, I guess go for it. Just know it's probably going to disappear here in the near future. And then lastly, we have the rotation node, which is the newest input node. Specifically for rotations. And we didn't have this before in Blender 4.1. Instead, you had to create a vector and then input it anywhere you needed a rotation if you just wanted a node to just exist to be able to manually play with and what have you. Now we have this in rotation form, and you can see they've labeled it nicely here to let you know that rotations are in degrees by default as opposed to vectors, which when you plug them into vectors that would be rotations before Blender 4.1 or just into rotations, they would usually get read as radians. So I really appreciate them letting you know with all of the rotation inputs, not just on this node, but most other nodes, the number you're inputting is in degrees And you can see with this tooltip, right, it's still processing it as radians, but you can input things as degrees because that's a lot more human friendly. Hi, also, while editing, I realized the remaining nodes that I wanted to talk about, I don't really have enough information just based on the release notes to properly explain. And in my testing, I really didn't have enough time to fully test everything to really wrap my head around it. So I kind of just want to give you some of my thoughts and point out the things that I understand from the notes, but know that anything I say here comes with a big asterisk of we just don't have a ton of information yet. Everything hasn't been outlined in the manual yet, so I'm having a hard time really picking apart the exact meaning of everything in the release notes. But I still wanted to share what I do have and let you know about some big changes that'll have big implications in the future. I just don't know how to use a lot of it just yet. So diving into this, we have 3 new nodes in the tools context that will hopefully allow for much more interesting and dynamic tool creation. I'm honestly really excited about these. It's just they pivot largely off of the matrix nodes, which we'll talk about in a second, and it's really these that are giving me the trouble in understanding everything, but we'll talk about that in a second. So just taking a look at the node tools, we have the mouse position node, which gives us the X, Y, height, and width of our bounding region selected by the mouse in the viewport. Those coordinates are in screen space, and it gives us the ability to use the mouse position as a user input when designing tools. I think that's really cool and really exciting. And going along with that, we have the viewport transform node, which gives us the position and direction your viewport is looking in 3D space. That's what I assume it is. Again, I tried really hard to make something with those nodes, but I wasn't able to get anything that looked really impressive and uh, I could predictably understand what it would do. So I'm really excited to play around with that more once the manual comes out because I definitely need to read up on how we're supposed to work with this. But for now, just know that we'll be able to play around with the mouse position and give the user more agency when creating tools. We also have a few changes around data blocks. I believe this is mostly in regard to library files because while I was testing, all of these different nodes do work in the tool context. So I'm pretty sure that's mostly just with creating your own libraries or extensions and loading files from outside of Blender consistently when you open up those tools in a new scene or when you give it to another user. That's at least what I could surmise. Then we have the active element. This is the third new node I was talking about. This gives us access to the vertex, edge, and face that the user has actively selected. The thing here is that I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between this and the active selection node. From my testing, they seem to be basically the same thing, so I really want to see what the difference is again when the manual comes out. Then it looks like we've got some performance improvements, just optimizations. I am not entirely sure what all this means on a deep technical level, but hey, any improvement and performance, like that's always a good thing. So I appreciate that. And then lastly, we have socket inspection. I did test this out. Apparently in 4.1, we couldn't hover over a socket and get any information about that input or output. It would just repeat the label back to us. But now it gives us more information when we inspect a socket and lets you know what's going on, where that data is coming from, how it's being processed, just like we get when we hover over a socket in the modifiers context. Then the last big thing I want to talk about are the new matrix sockets. Now, I'm honestly really excited about these because they're going to allow us to do so much. It's just talking about matrices and really understanding how Blender is using them is a little beyond me, again, because it's not well explained in the release notes, so I'm really looking forward to looking over the manual. But if you want to give it a try, go for it, obviously. And also check out 3 Blue 1 Brown. He does a lot of really good math explainer videos, and he's got a whole series talking about linear algebra and matrices and how they represent and transform space, which is really huge and awesome that we're able to use that now. It's just, oh boy, I need a refresher on that. And if you've never touched linear algebra at all, definitely check out his channel. I'll link that in the description because, yeah, there's a lot of power here. And if you're intimidated by the thought of matrices and linear algebra, just know that everything you've been doing up until this point is still valid. This isn't replacing anything, it's just an additional tool in our arsenal. And then lastly, we have a list of changes to the overall node editor. Some of these I was able to take a look at, some of them I couldn't quite figure out what they meant, so I'm just going to put this up here so that you can check them out. And of course, if you want to check out Blender 4.2 beta for yourself before it is fully released next month, what you can do is go to blender.org and go to download, then go to builds, and once it loads, there we go. Here you'll see Blender 4.2 beta, and just make sure that you select whatever system you're working with, and you can just download it here. Then if you want the release notes, what you need to do is go up to Docs and then Release Notes, and just go to Blender 4.2 LTS. And then under there, everything that I've been referencing is under nodes and physics. And that's where all of this documentation exists. You can click on any of these links and it'll tell you more about the specific thing it's talking about. It's just, this is where it gets more cryptic because this is basically the developers' notes, right? This is not supposed to help the public to understand. This is to help other developers understand what changes have been made and how it integrates to Blender as a whole. Which is why I keep saying that this is a bit cryptic, is because it wasn't written for me. It wasn't written for any of us. It was written to help others develop and build off of what has been added, which is one of the things that makes Blender so wonderful, right? But it makes it so that until they release a manual, it can be a lot harder to understand what it is exactly that they're talking about. But anyway, that is it for this one. That's everything I wanted to talk about in the new Blender 4.2 update. This is, again, just for nodes. There is so much in this entire update, so check out anything else that interests you. And yeah, I hope this has been helpful, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Oh, and they added an extend socket to the menu node. I am so excited about this!